I sat in that dim committee room, watching my notes cut down while names of the dead were still being typed for telegrams. The strongest warnings I had seen in black ink vanished into locked cabinets, replaced by phrases that bled responsibility thin. Each draft of the report shifted the weight downward, leaving the high tables untouched while junior men carried blame they had not planned. When I signed my initials beneath those softened sentences, the room fell quiet, and the silence has never quite left. On the morning of 23rd August 1942, in a smoke-stained government building in London, clerks carried stacks of brown files into a converted committee room on the upper floor. Outside, the city still bore the marks of earlier raids. Inside, the work was quieter. Chairs had been arranged in rows facing a long table. The small name cards marked places for the chair, the legal advisor, the military members and the secretary. The inquiry was temporary, convened in response to a raid on a defended port across the Channel that had taken place only days earlier. Hundreds of men had not returned. Telegrams and casualty lists were still being delivered to families. In this building, the task was different. Here, the work was to examine what had happened and to decide how it would be recorded. In a side room, away from the main chamber, a civilian clerk named Ellis laid out shorthand notebooks, freshly sharpened pencils, and the agenda for the day. He had been seconded from a ministry because he took clear notes and worked quickly. His role in the war was not at sea or on the beaches, but behind a desk, capturing words as they were spoken and turning them into minutes that would be read by officials who were not present. He knew that the committee had been formed rapidly. He had seen the minute establishing it, typed on thin paper with narrow margins. The terms of reference spoke of ascertaining the circumstances of the recent combined operation and making recommendations to prevent a recurrence of avoidable loss. The language was formal, almost neutral. It did not say that the raid had been a disaster. It did not mention that some units had never even reached the shore. It did not speak of intelligence summaries that had warned about beaches swept by overlapping fields of fire or harbour batteries that had not been fully neutralised. Ellis had seen those summaries. They were in the preliminary file marked Background, Intelligence and Planning. They lay under his hand now, their covers smudged from other people's fingers. His task that first morning was routine. He checked that each bundle of papers matched the list on his sheet. Operational orders, naval reports, Air Force contributions, signals traffic summaries, medical returns. He noticed that the file of pre-raid warnings, the one that had carried red marginal notes from a coastal intelligence officer, had been taken out. In its place was a thinner folder with a new label. Selected intelligence papers. He looked at the contents. The strongest warnings were not there. They had been replaced by more cautious assessments, documents that spoke of possible heavy opposition and uncertain enemy dispositions. There was no paper that said in plain language that the defenders had been reinforced and that tanks might bog down in shingle under fire. He hesitated for a moment, then closed the folder and put it on the trolley. His job, he reminded himself, was to record what was said. The selection of what would be seen had been decided elsewhere. Down the corridor, the members of the panel gathered in a smaller meeting room. The chair was the senior lawyer, with experience in military matters. Around him sat a naval representative, an army representative, and a senior civil servant from the central staff. They spoke quietly over tea. The minutes of this preliminary discussion would not be recorded. The conversation set the tone anyway. The chair reviewed the terms of reference. He stressed the need for speed and discretion. The war was ongoing. There could be no public scandal, no weakening of confidence in senior leadership. The naval member remarked that the enemy would exploit any sign of division. The army representative agreed, adding that the men who had taken part in the raid were still in training camps, hospitals, and prisoner-of-war cages. Their morale, he said, depended on a sense that the plan had been sound and the execution brave. The civil servant spoke about Parliament. Questions would be asked. Families wanted answers. The panel had to demonstrate that lessons were being learned. But he also noted, with careful emphasis, that the combined operations staff had launched many successful raids and that its senior figures were essential to future plans. As they spoke, their concerns settled into an unspoken principle. Their responsibility could be discussed. Blame could not be allowed to rise too high. In the main room, witnesses waited on chairs along the wall. Some were officers from units that had gone ashore. Some were naval officers from escort ships and landing craft flotillas. A few wore bandages. Most were tired. They had been brought back from hospitals or depots to give evidence to a committee none of them had heard of before. Ellis took his place at a small table at the side of the chamber, close enough to hear but far enough not to distract. He tested his pencil, glanced at the electric clock on the wall, and waited for the door at the far end to open. At 10 o'clock, the members of the panel entered. The chair took his seat at the centre of the long table. To his right, the naval and army representatives. To his left, the civil servant and the legal advisor. The atmosphere was restrained. The first witness was called. The process was familiar, drawn from earlier boards and inquiries. The witness gave name, role, and unit. He described his duties on the day of the raid. He spoke of embarkation in darkness, the channels across the sea, the first sight of the coast, and the fire that met them, Ellis wrote, his hand moving steadily across the page. The chair asked how closely the attack had conformed to the written plan. He asked whether the timings for preliminary bombardment had been met. He asked whether liaison between naval and land forces had been adequate. The questions were structured. They followed a pattern designed to test coordination and execution, not design. When the witness tried to stray into wider issues, as the chair steered him back. When a lieutenant from a commando unit began to describe how he had heard rumours, before the raid, that the enemy had strengthened the defences, the legal advisor interrupted gently. "Please confine yourself to what is within your knowledge," he said. "Matters of intelligence assessment will be dealt with separately." Ellis noted the exchange. He wrote down the words, but he also marked the margin with a small symbol he reserved for comments he knew might later be cut. He had learned, over years of drafting minutes, that some parts of a discussion never reached the final record. As the day went on, the pattern repeated. Witnesses spoke of heavy fire on approaches, of landing craft destroyed before they could beach, of tanks immobilized on shingle, or stalled in water too deep. They described confusion in wireless circuits, smoke that failed to screen as planned, and air support that seemed to come late or not at all. Many tried to explain that they had done what they could with the information and orders they had been given. They hinted at warnings raised and dismissed. They spoke of rehearsals carried out on friendly coasts that did not resemble the target. Each time the testimony approached the design of the operation, the chair guided it back to the conduct of the men. He praised their courage. He acknowledged their difficulties. He did not invite them to describe who had overruled which concern in pre-raid conferences. In the evenings, after the witnesses had left and the panel had retired, Ellis returned to his small office to turn shorthand into continuous prose. He worked through his notes, page by page, reconstructing the sequence of questions and answers. When he finished a draft, he took it to the secretary of the committee, a spare man from central staff whose task was to prepare the official minutes. The secretary read quickly. He drew his pencil through some sentences. He softened others. When he came to the point where the commando lieutenant had mentioned rumours of strengthened defences, he paused. "We can't have this here," he said quietly. "Intelligence papers are under separate control. The committee will address them through written submissions, not through remarks in oral evidence." He put a line through the paragraph and handed the paper back. "Adjust it to keep him to his own actions," he added. Ellis retyped the section, removing the reference to warning. The lieutenant's account in the minutes became a simple first-hand description of a difficult landing under fire. His earlier attempt to suggest that concerns had been raised and not acted upon disappeared from the formal record. In the following days, the inquiry moved from survivors to staff officers. Operations planners arrived in neat uniforms. They carried folders and maps. They described the raid as part of a wider program of tests and diversions. They emphasized the constraints under which they had worked. Shipping was limited. Surprise was essential. Reconnaissance photographs had been examined, they said, and the plan devised accordingly. The panel listened attentively. The question of pre-raid warnings came up only obliquely. The one planning officer referred to certain doubts that had been expressed regarding artillery positions on the heights. He added that these doubts had been allayed by assurances that the Air Force would neutralize key batteries. The chair did not ask who had given those assurances. The legal advisor did not ask for the names of officers who had raised the doubts. The inquiry, Ellis realized, was interested in whether the raid had been consistent with accepted doctrine, not whether doctrine itself had failed. Among the witnesses was an intelligence officer who had served with a small team responsible for analysing enemy coastal defences. He had contributed to the original warning papers. He came to the committee with a carefully prepared written memorandum. In it, he set out step by step the information available before the raid. He recorded when units had been reinforced, when new weapons had been observed, and when local agents had reported changes in enemy routines. He described the meetings at which he had briefed senior officers. He wrote in measured terms that his concerns about strong points covering the main beaches had not been reflected in the final plan. When he appeared before the panel, he placed a copy of this memorandum on the table. The chair thanked him. The members scanned the first pages. The legal advisor noted that the document would be taken as read. The questioning that followed was short. The intelligence officer was asked whether his assessments had been based on reliable sources. He replied that they had. And he was asked whether he had been given an opportunity to present them in person to the combined planning staff. He said that he had been present at one meeting, but that the agenda had been full and the discussion had moved quickly. He was asked whether, in his judgment, the raid had been impossible. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Not impossible, he said at last, but hazardous in ways that might have been mitigated had certain points been more fully considered. The naval representative noted the phrase, "not impossible," and wrote it down. The panel did not ask him to list the points that had been set aside. After he left, his memorandum was placed in a separate folder. Later, when Ellis looked for it, he found that the folder had been moved to a cabinet marked Classified Intelligence Restricted Circulation. It did not appear in the main bundle of evidence that would accompany the committee's report. The weeks passed. Outside, other operations took place. Convoys sailed, bombers flew. The war shifted, as it always did, from one sector to another. Inside the committee rooms, the work went on at its own pace. Ellis recorded, the panel questioned, the secretary drafted. One afternoon, after a long session with the senior members of the combined operations staff, the tone of the inquiry sharpened. The panel had invited an experienced officer to explain the final phase of planning for the raid. He described the repeated revisions to the timetable, the discussions about naval gunfire, and the negotiations over air support. And he spoke of pressure from higher levels to demonstrate offensive spirit. He did not name those levels, but his meaning was clear enough. When asked whether he had been aware of the full extent of intelligence warnings, he replied that he had seen summaries. He had not, he said, seen the harsher assessments that had circulated in specialist channels. He suggested that information might have been filtered before reaching the operational table. The room became still. The legal advisor looked at the chair. The civil servant tapped his pencil. This line of thought threatened to trace responsibility back into the system that connected the intelligence staffs to planning staffs, and, from there, to the senior commanders who had approved the operation. The chair adjusted his spectacles and moved to another angle, and he asked whether the planning conferences had been properly minuted. The officer confirmed that records had been kept. He did not add that some of those records had been written in the careful language that avoided attributing firm positions to particular individuals. After the witness left, the panel retired for a private discussion. Ellis did not attend these meetings. He saw their effects later, in the changes made to drafts. Yet on this day, as he passed the door, he caught a few phrases through the wood. Cannot undermine confidence. Must not suggest negligence. Lessons, yes, but framed within doctrine. That evening, the secretary marked several sections of the day's minutes for substantial revision. He trimmed the officer's suggestion that intelligence had been filtered, and the passage became a general remark about the inevitable compression of material in wartime planning. The hint that higher pressure demands had influenced the timetable was reduced to an acknowledgement of operational urgency dictated by the wider situation. The words which could have pointed beyond the raid itself towards the structure of decision-making were softened into abstractions. Ellis felt a quiet unease. He was not a soldier. He was not responsible for what had happened on the beaches. His responsibility lay in the way the story of the raid would be fixed on paper. He knew that in the years to come, those papers would stand as the official view of events. He also knew that many of the sharpest warnings and most candid comments were being removed or blurred, yet his position was modest. He could suggest alternative phrasings. He could query unclear passages. He could not insist that suppressed paragraphs be restored. At home, in the small lodgings where he rented a room, he tried not to dwell on it. He told himself that the war required unity. He reminded himself that the families of the dead might prefer a narrative in which errors were presented as the inevitable cost of a hard campaign, rather than the result of specific decisions. Still, when he opened his notebook in the morning and saw the marks that indicated where words would not survive into the record, he felt the distance widen between what had been said in the room and what would later be remembered. the inquiry eventually turned its attention from the raid itself to the question of who would be named in the report. Drafts circulated. After the chair prepared an outline of findings and recommendations. In its first version, the document was unusually frank. It noted that intelligence had been inadequately integrated into operational planning. It stated that certain objections raised at conferences had been insufficiently explored. It drew attention to organizational confusion in the chain of responsibility. Names were not listed, but the implications were clear. This draft reached the desks of senior figures outside the committee. The reactions varied. Some welcomed the directness, seeing in it an opportunity to rectify weaknesses before larger operations took place. Others saw danger. They feared that such language, once committed to paper, might be seized upon by critics, both inside and outside the country. They worried that foreign observers, reading between the lines, would discern uncertainty at the summit of command. Above all, they felt that the public should not be given reason to doubt the competence of those who would soon be asking men to land on hostile shores again. Comments came back. Some were written in neat margins, others were conveyed verbally. They converged on the same point. The tone of the findings, it was said, should be firm, but not accusatory. The report should identify shortcomings in systems, not individuals. It should stress the bravery of the troops and the difficulties inherent in combined operations. It should recommend improvements in training and coordination. It should not suggest that the raid had been the outcome of flawed judgment at high levels. Inside the committee, yet the members debated how far they were prepared to modify their conclusions. The lawyer chair understood both the legal and political dimensions. The military members knew that their own careers were tied, in subtle ways, to the reputations of those above them. The civil servant saw the wider picture of parliamentary scrutiny and public opinion. They compromised. The wording of the findings was altered. Intelligence had been inadequately integrated, became intelligence products were not in all cases fully exploited. Objections raised at conferences had been insufficiently explored, became mechanisms for the expression of differing views, require clarification. Organizational confusion became certain ambiguities in responsibility. The language shifted responsibility from persons to processes. It pointed at structure, but in terms so mild that no one could readily be held to account. At the same time, the report's narrative sections began to emphasize other factors. They dwelt on the strength of the enemy defences. They described unexpected resistance. They noted the difficulties of landing under fire. They hinted that no plan could have guaranteed success, given the constraints of weather, surprise and resources. A new section was added, praising the determination of the men involved. It spoke of gallantry and perseverance. This was true, and the families would recognise it. Yet it sat alongside a muted version of the planning story. Public emphasis would fall naturally on the courage of the troops and the ferocity of the enemy, not on the mitigable errors that had made the raid even more costly than it needed to be. One question remained. Who would bear what blame remained in the document? The committee, under pressure, allowed the report to imply that certain failings lay at the level of intermediate command. Battalion and brigade staffs, it said, had not always communicated clearly. Some landing timings had not been adjusted in light of changing conditions. Signal arrangements had proved inadequate. These shortcomings could be laid at the feet of officers whose names were known within the services, but not to the public. They were also officers whose careers, while important, were not central to the wider narrative of the war effort. Senior command, by contrast, was treated with care. The report referred respectfully to the high authorities whose strategic judgment had decided on the necessity of the raid, and it did not question their insistence that offensive action be maintained. It did not examine their role in approving the specific plan. It accepted as a premise that the decision to attack that particular port at that particular time had been sound in principle. In practice, the effect was to shield the highest levels from detailed scrutiny. Ellis watched this process unfold in the text he was helping to polish. He saw the way in which sentences that pointed upwards were replaced with sentences that dissipated responsibility into the air. He noticed how often the word unavoidable appeared. He observed the consistent drift of blame towards those who had themselves worked under orders. He did not imagine that he could change the course of the report. He could at times argue for clarity, but when the secretary proposed a phrase that was so abstract as to be almost meaningless, Ellis might suggest a more concrete alternative. Sometimes his suggestions were accepted. More often they were set aside. He understood that the real boundaries of the report were being drawn not at his level, but in conversations he did not attend and in offices beyond his reach. On the day the final draft was approved by the committee, the air in the room was heavy. The members signed their names at the bottom of the closing page. They had worked within the limits they believed necessary. They had recorded failures within the chain of lower and intermediate command. They had recommended improved training, clearer procedures, and better integration of intelligence. They had consciously or not allowed the questions that might have disturbed senior command to slide away. The chair thanked them for their service. The legal advisor gathered up the signed copies. The civil servant began to plan the controlled release of the report. There would be an announcement in Parliament. An official summary would be prepared for public consumption. Only a small circle would see the full text. After the meeting, Ellis returned to his office. On his desk lay the files he had worked with for weeks. His notebooks were filled with shorthand lines recording remarks that could not be found in the final report. Here, in cramped symbols, were mentions of warnings that had been set aside, of doubts that had been minimized, of pressure from above that had compressed planning timelines. Here were the traces of a different story of the raid, one in which responsibility extended further than the report acknowledged. He locked the notebooks in a drawer. He knew that they were technically committee property. He also knew that no one had asked for them. The official minutes existed in clean copies, lodged with the secretary. His shorthand books were, for the moment, invisible. In the months that followed, the report performed its public function. In the legislative chamber, a minister referred to its findings. He described the raid as a costly but instructive operation. He quoted passages that spoke of gallantry and resilience. He acknowledged certain technical and procedural shortcomings and assured the Assembly that they were being addressed. Questions were asked, but they were limited by the information available. Opposition members sought to press for detail. They were told that for reasons of security, the full report could not be disclosed. Families read the official summary in the newspapers. Some felt a measure of comfort in the recognition of sacrifice. Others sensed, without having access to the details, that something lay behind the cautious language. They could not see the drafts in which stronger criticisms had been thinned. They could not know that warnings, fully spelled out in memoranda, had been reduced to phrases about difficult conditions. Within the services, the impact of the report was mixed. At lower levels, officers whose units had suffered heavily read the findings with a tightness in the throat. They saw that certain decisions taken above them had been recast as misunderstandings at their own level. That they recognized the implication that they had failed in coordination, even when they remembered practical obstacles that had been beyond their control. Some accepted this as part of military life. Others carried a quiet resentment. At higher levels, the report was read as confirmation that the combined operations program could continue with minor adjustments. Senior planners acknowledged the recommendations on training and communications. They noted the need to draw intelligence more firmly into their conferences. Few spent long on the sections that might have raised deeper questions about how warnings had been weighed against the desire to act. The war pressed on, operations grew larger, new landings were prepared, supported by more ships, more aircraft, and more experience. The failed raid remained in the background, and a lesson cited in professional journals, a reference point in lectures, a cautionary story in staff colleges. But the official version, shaped by the committee's report, was the one most commonly repeated. It was in this environment that the Council of Blame, as some staff officers called it in private, achieved its quiet purpose. By framing the narrative of the raid in a particular way, it had helped to ensure that the reputations of senior command remained intact. It had confirmed that errors could be located and addressed without drawing a line back to the highest decisions. It had given the apparatus of war a way to absorb a costly failure without tearing itself apart. Ellis continued his work. After the inquiry closed, he was assigned to other committees. He took notes on industrial disputes, civil defense measures, and post-war planning. He rarely spoke about the raid. Years later, when he looked back on that period, he thought less of the specific sentences he had typed and more of the pattern they formed. He remembered how evidence that challenged convenient assumptions had been filtered out. He recalled how language had been used to shift responsibility downwards and sideways, never quite upwards. He understood that the committee had operated within pressures and fears that were real. Yet he could not entirely dismiss the sense that something important had been buried. The remnants of that buried story lay in files that were not easy to find. The intelligence officer's full memorandum remained separated from the main body of evidence. The early drafts of the report, with their more direct phrasing, they were filed in a cabinet that only a few could access. Some of the most candid exchanges survived only in shorthand pads that nobody officially required. The men who had died on the shingle knew nothing of councils and committees. Their memory lived on in regimental rolls, in family stories, and in graves on foreign soil. The inquiry had not been tasked with commemorating them. Its function had been to examine, to assign, and to protect. In doing so, it had left a legacy of its own. That legacy was not a dramatic revelation or a single decisive verdict. It was a record of how institutions respond when failure threatens to reach too high. It showed how panels formed after disasters can, under pressure, narrow their gaze, redistribute responsibility, and shape the understanding of events for decades. The story of that raid, though like so many episodes in the war, would be told and retold. Much of what was said would follow the lines set down in the report. Only those who looked more closely at the surviving fragments would see the gap between what had been warned and what had been officially acknowledged. For viewers today, reflecting on inquiries like this one is a way to remember not only those who went ashore, but also how their fate was later discussed, defended, and, in some respects, obscured. If you wish for more of these quieter stories to be examined in detail, consider sharing this account so that such lessons are not left entirely within closed files.